approved.
Welcome. This is my first actual video on YouTube. I am RASU, and I have been an artist my entire life, but I pretty much dropped it back in 5th grade, then picked it back up during quarantine, which was my junior year. So from the time of this video being made, it has been 2.5 years since I started drawing again. I wrote the script and study for most of this video at around 17 years old, but I am now 18. This channel will be an art channel, of course. I'll upload my art process videos here and there, maybe upload shorts, but I will come to YouTube when the time tells to commentate, do more videos like these, or give tips and explanations. Maybe if someone has any courage to ask anything in the comments, I'll do a video answering your questions. So with introductions out of the way, allow 17-year-old me to take it from here. So anyways, about Wlop. I've been studying his work for about 5 to 6 months of the time this video gets posted, and I have really wanted to share this with the art community because for some utterly unknown reason, nobody has truly gone in depth on this art style, nor the process on how to obtain it. So I put together a greatly structured analysis with timestamps for you to make Wlop's work comprehensible, since he's only uploaded one tutorial from about 7 years ago. So with that out of the way, let's start with the breakdown and the brushes first, then I'll move on to the actual rendering phase. Alright, first, I will need to do a breakdown of techniques you need to know beforehand. Taking a look at Wlop's work, zooming in, we notice immediately that his drawings are literally not detailed, even the skin itself. This is due to his fundamental knowledge of colors, contrast, and realistic interaction. This is a skill nearly every painter has built up in order for a nice stylistic choice, and also to leave the viewer with more room for imagination. This is one of the bases for painting like a pro. So, for the interactions between lighting and objects, I'll use these pieces as an example. We can see here that there is a red glow in these parts of the skin. This is called subsurface scattering. You probably already know what this is, but for those who don't, subsurface scattering is when light shines through your skin and it appears transparent. We can see this in ears and fingers, and even through fleshy parts like the neck or arms, but it is very faint in those parts. Lastly, there is a line at the edges of the shade in light because the light builds up at that edge point. You can see this line everywhere. Next, we have warm and cool areas on the body. This is crucial to learn. Areas with a lot of blood flow like the nose, cheeks, and joints are warm. Also, the concave areas like the armpit and very close fingers are very warm. Cool areas are parts of the skin that don't have as much blood flow, like the forehead, shoulder blades, and exposed convex areas on your body, as shown here. Wlop also makes the piece feel alive by adding in exaggerated, realistic lighting scenarios and interaction. The ambient light bouncing off and onto the character's face and crevices to give it almost a marble look. The ambient light is always present, and hard-hitting light on the body and hair gives a piece a more striking look. For backgrounds, Wong is heavily inspired by Renaissance, Rococo, Greek, and Gothic architecture, so get a ton of references and studies on them for a better fantasy scene. Wong never makes backgrounds empty, even when there's just one character like Princess Aeolian here, for example. There's still space, she's in an open room with a reflective floor. Always make the background make sense, even in darkness. He adds other elements to show more of the bigger picture in his illustrations, like the literal darkness consuming his characters with particles resembling stars to tell more of a story, and light coming from off the screen to make more than just a basic portrait. That is the key to illustration. When sketching, do not detail sketches at all. Simplify it completely. Think about the structure and form of the area, background, and objects rather than sketching out every individual nook and cranny of it. This will give a simple description for your mind to digest. This goes both ways when drawing a person, but make it slightly more refined on the face to get the positions and proportions accurate. Overall, don't become a slave to the sketch. And I recommend sketching like this only if you know exactly how you will go about your piece. You will get better at this technique over time. Finally, value composition. For any piece you are making, it is good to put your subject in high contrast and filler elements like the background in lower contrast to make your subject pop. There are a little more techniques, but these are the keys to making better pieces. Here's a fun fact. Wong is very experienced in the digital field, of course, and I've asked him on the topic of watercolors. He actually told me that he is not that well versed in watercolor. So what he's done to change that is study how certain watercolor painters draw backgrounds and elements. This is important because you must study and learn from multiple different art forms to get well versed in art. Before I start, the brush section will be put into 3 categories, which is grayscale, rendering, and metal/jewelry. This section of the video is not his process phase. This will only be covering the brushes he uses and how he uses them. Now, while in the base phase, Wong uses a sandpaper type of smooth-edged round brush titled Skin. The equivalent to this brush on Procreate is the Avalon brush. The Skin brush is used for the hair, skin, some background elements, highlights, shape of shadows, and clothing. It is also used on metal such as armor and jewelry, so the Skin brush is the universal brush in his pieces. While adding the ambient light, spotlight, and shadows, use the Big Soft brush. The closest brush on Procreate to this is the Soft brush. The Big Soft brush is also interchangeable with the Skin brush when creating the background in this stage, since Wlop used it for the start of many pieces such as this one and this one. I would recommend using the Big Soft for closer parts of the piece and actual soft materials and objects like beds, seats, pillows, mainly when in grayscale. Next up, he uses a brush called Brush Big Painting for walls in the background to give it a textured look. There are other brushes for textures, but this is the main one for walls. Last but not least, in Wong's Chinese New Year 4 piece, he used a brush called Wlop. This was used while he was color blocking the background, the feng huang, and the firecrackers. This brush is possible to decently replicate on Procreate with a bit of editing on the basic round brush, but it's really not that necessary. Here's a side note, since his Skin brush is rough, you can get a good replicate of this brush on Procreate with the texture brushes or any of the other rough brushes for the background. Next up, the color phase. Once the base colors are set, he uses the Big Soft for most of the beginning part of his process. He uses the Big Soft for the soft reds and saturated areas of the face and body, like our cheeks, lips, and nose. He then uses the Skin brush for harder red areas that need shape in between fingers, nostrils, and so on. Next, he then uses the Big Soft for the ambient reflection on skin and hair. When adding color dodge, he uses the Big Soft brush. When the light and ambience goes through and hits the hair entirely to make a general light area, he turns on color dodge and uses the Big Soft brush. The color of the light itself hitting the skin area and clothes will also use the Big Soft brush. He basically uses color dodge with Big Soft for the hard-hitting direct light that bounces off skin from sunlight to lighten up the areas of the portrait. I will go more in depth on this in the actual rendering phase of the video, but these are only on the brushes. Once he's done with the general lighting and skin colors with the Big Soft brush, he starts on the hair. When on the hair rendering phase, the hair strands and spaces always begin with the Skin brush, then get overlapped with the brush again softly for dark parts, highlights, and bounce light. He gives the eyes, mouth, and eyebrows shape with the Skin brush along with other parts of the body when necessary. When detailing the hair, he uses the directional brushy for the strands and the illusion of hair volume. The best way to replicate this on Procreate is to edit a rougher brush and make the tip size sharper. It won't look as good as the real brushes, but it's the best Procreate has. If you do have this brush on Procreate, however, you'll have to manually edit them to fit certain flows that Procreate doesn't have automatically. These are the settings I use. For the eyelashes, he uses a brush called Sharp 19-1. And finally, textures. He uses the Big Painting 1 for walls and Chalk Brush 1 for statues, fabric, and so on. The hard round 21 can be interchangeable or combined with the chalk brush, but it's mainly used for the additional textures on jewelry and background elements. Jewelry also uses the skin and hard round 50 brushes, but overall, jewelry will just need a really sharp brush. So in summary, Wong uses the big soft brush for mapping out colors, then goes in with refinements and harder shapes using the skin brush, then adds texture brushes to finalize the elements of the piece. These brushes follow the same principles as the basic brushes, it's just how you utilize them that counts. But overall, this is pretty basic rendering with more specific preferred steps added onto them. So the brushes he uses for metal and jewelry. This follows the same principle as the other two phases. It's almost as if both of the phases are combined. He uses the skin brush for the base light, glare, and base shape of the armor or metal. He then uses texture brushes, which are the chalk brush and the hard round 21 for the light of the metal and the implied detail. For color blocking jewelry dots, sharp clean metal design, and the reflection of the ambience, he uses the sharp 19-1 brush. Note that the chalk brush and skin brush can also be used on ambient colors, so play around with them and have fun. So continuing, next up we have the Now that we understand how to use his brushes, it is now time to move on to the actual drawing. Once you've roughly sketched out the scene you want, lower the opacity of the sketch layer enough to not overwhelm your base values. Next, add a layer underneath the sketch with the base value for the background, depending on how light or dark you want it to be. Now, make another layer on top of the background and fill in your foreground sketches using the skin brush with the opposite value. Here I chose a darker value for my character, since I want the setting to be morning. Now add in the light parts onto the base of the character's face and body to give the illusion of 3D. This can vary depending on the lighting scenario, and you can go in with shadow first if you want, but to keep it easier, let's start with light. Next, add in the dark parts and shadow. The dark parts are the main technique used to mold the face in this step. Now, add in a simple base shape of the hair and or clothing with a slightly darker value again. You can also do this before adding in the base values. For clothes, you can cut out and select parts of the subject and change the contrast with curves to give the illusion of clothing. If you aren't satisfied with the values, always remember you can change the contrast whenever you want with the curves tool. Next, really visualize the lighting and where it would hit. Also, grab a reference. Make sure the light is on your character from the directions of the background light sources, and add in harder hitting highlights depending on the lighting scenario you chose. Add lighting into your background with simple brush strokes, either using the big soft or skin brush depending on how you're making it. Do not overthink, just trust the process because the beginning always looks rough. After this, detail as much of the subject as you want and roughly block in the background for a decent amount of time, and then you're done. So finally, make sure your foundation is good. Having a good contrast between light and dark makes a good value composition so that nothing clashes. It will make the rest of this process way more forgiving. So earlier in the grayscale phase, I mentioned the curves tool. So before we get into the color rendering section, you must understand the basics of curves. Curves are extremely simple to understand. The part that people actually get stuck on is just understanding color mixing, so I will simplify. If you do not know what the curve setting is, it basically changes the hue, brightness, and saturation of a selection in your drawing based on which channel you edit. So I will explain all you need to know. And this goes the same way for Photoshop. The horizontal axis is the value. The left side gets darker, and the right side gets lighter. The vertical axis is just the amount of pixels, so the higher the pixel count on the curve graph, that's how many pixels are in that value range. And that's all you need to know for gamma. The three color channels follow the same rule but has something special about them. Instead of changing the gamma, it changes the color of whatever value depending on where you place the points. And there's also this vertical line you see here. This is the cross section between two colors. The higher you place your point, the original color gets brighter, and the lower you place your point, it becomes a completely different color, depending on which color channel you chose. The red channel turns green, the green channel turns purple, and the blue channel turns yellow. I plan to make a more in-depth curves video eventually, but the color mixing part becomes your own preference, so experiment and go wild. The beginning part of this phase will vary depending on Photoshop compared to Procreate, so I will explain how you should use both. Pay attention and do not skip. On Procreate, you cannot make an adjustment layer, so I will show you the best ways you can make this work the exact same way it does on Photoshop. First, combine all of the layers that make up one element of your drawing into one layer, that being foreground, midground, background, and the added on elements. Here's an example. My character here, I drew her with multiple layers of course, so I just combine all the layers in one, but do not combine an overlapping layer or it will be extremely difficult to draw underneath. Look here, I made her arm separate to her body since it overlaps with her hair, but if you made this mistake, remember the lasso tool is your friend, and you will be perfectly fine. Make separate layers for the background and foreground. They should be on their own respective layers. So we're now left with the background, foreground, and the subject on their own layer. So starting with the background layer, duplicate it for a backup, then add the base environmental color and value using curves. Doing this with the background first sets your base environmental color for the piece. This will make everything a lot easier to color on top of. Now this is where the two different methods come in. If you are a Photoshop user, just listen to everything except the copy and pasting side. So beginning with Procreate, you need to copy and paste the subject layer 3 times, then create a base color, a cool tone, and a warm tone with curves. This is in order for you to add cools and warms onto the skin easier. Another way to do it is to duplicate the subject once and create a base tone with curves, then draw in the warm and cool parts yourself. So do either of these 2 steps and you have your base tones for your subject. Next is the foreground. All you have to do is add tones that match the environment, or just draw in the foreground yourself if you didn't already add it in the grayscale phase. And with this, we are at the base of the piece. Now for Photoshop users, do the same thing I said for Procreate, but instead of duplicating and combining layers and all of that, just create a curves layer for the foreground and background, then add your layers accordingly. Once this is done, add in your base colors, then create a curves layer and set the base tone for your subject. Then add an adjustment layer for your subject to implement the cools and warms with the blue and red channels. If you do not know how adjustment layers work, black undos and white redos. You are now done with the base colors. Alright, this is current RASU speaking, and that is part 1 of the Wlop video. And in part 2, I will be covering the rendering phase 1 and 2, and then the jewelry and metal phase, and then the finalization. So yeah, thank you so much if you made it all the way through to this video, and I will be making more pieces and more videos soon. And also, since this is current me, I definitely want to make more videos explaining world building and art analysis in games, so stay tuned for that. And with all of this being said, more pieces soon.